Welcome to the world of science fiction, where extraordinary tales and boundless imagination come to life. Enjoy the story and don't forget to subscribe. Jackson Ford's head swam. A dull, rhythmic throbbing pulsed behind his eyes, a counterpoint to the alien cacophony that assaulted his ears. The last thing he remembered was tweaking the plasma conduits on the experimental warp drive, pushing its theoretical limits one last time before clocking out. Now, he was bound to a bizarre contraption, a kind of hovering dais, in the center of what could only be described as an intergalactic auction house. Panic clawed at his throat. He was naked. Utterly, completely, exposed to the leering gazes of hundreds of beings he couldn't even begin to categorize. Insectoids with shimmering carapaces rubbed elbows with hulking, reptilian creatures adorned with glittering jewelry. Floating, jellyfish-like entities pulsed with soft, internal light, their tentacles twitching with what Jackson could only assume was morbid curiosity. A towering figure, easily 10 feet tall and covered in iridescent scales, stood on a raised platform, its 4 arms gesticulating wildly. Its voice, amplified by some unseen technology, boomed in a guttural language that made Jackson's teeth ache. This had to be a dream. A truly, spectacularly awful dream. But the chill of the metal against his skin, the weight of the unseen restraints, the sheer sensory overload of the crowd, it all felt agonizingly real. "Is anyone there who speaks English?" Jackson yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. The alien crowd responded with a mix of chirps, hisses, and what sounded disturbingly like laughter. His words were meaningless noise to them. He was a curiosity, an object, not a person. The towering alien, apparently the auctioneer, turned its multifaceted eyes toward Jackson. 2 of its hands manipulated a holographic display, bringing up what looked like a series of scans and data points hovering in the air. Jackson felt a tingling sensation wash over him, a violation that went far beyond the simple fact of his nudity. They were probing him, analyzing him, reducing him to a set of quantifiable characteristics. A wave of nausea washed over him. He tried to struggle against the restraints, but they tightened in response, biting into his wrists and ankles. He was trapped, helpless, a prize on display for the highest bidder. Then, the auctioneer gestured, and the dais began to rotate slowly, giving the assembled aliens a 360-degree view of their new acquisition. The murmurs intensified, becoming a low, predatory hum. Jackson squeezed his eyes shut, shame burning in his cheeks. He was a specimen, a freak, nothing more than meat on the market. Suddenly, a voice cut through the alien din, clear and surprisingly melodic. "Intriguing. Very intriguing indeed." Jackson opened his eyes, his heart leaping with a flicker of hope. Standing at the edge of the dais was a woman, though calling her that felt inadequate. She was Xylia, tall and slender, with skin the color of polished obsidian. Her eyes glowed with an inner luminescence, a vibrant emerald green that seemed to pierce through him. She wore a form-fitting suit of shimmering, liquid metal that accentuated every curve. Xylia tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over Jackson with cool assessment. "Tell me, little Earthling," she said, her voice laced with amusement, "are you as interesting as you appear?" Jackson swallowed, trying to regain some semblance of composure. I'm Jackson," he stammered. "Jackson Ford. I'm an engineer. I don't know why I'm here." Xylia chuckled, a sound like wind chimes. "Oh, I suspect you have a general idea. You're a novelty, a curiosity. Something new for a galaxy that's seen everything. And judging by the enthusiasm of the crowd, a rather desirable one." She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Though I must admit," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "your species is underwhelming. Scrawny, relatively weak, and possessing a rather limited technological capacity. What makes you so special?" Before Jackson could answer, a group of other Xylia-like women approached the platform. They were all equally striking, variations on the same theme of dark skin, luminous eyes, and impossible curves. They began circling Jackson, their voices a chorus of alien observations. Such pale skin. Almost translucent. And look at the musculature. Surprisingly dense for its size. Its cranial capacity seems adequate. But is it intelligent? One of the women reached out and poked Jackson in the ribs, eliciting a gasp of discomfort. Careful, Lyra, Xylia warned. We don't know if it's hostile. Lyra, the woman who had poked him, laughed. Hostile? What could this little thing possibly do? She reached out again, this time running her hand down Jackson's arm. But I must admit, the texture is unusual. Like soft velvet over steel. The other women joined in, their hands exploring his body with a detached, almost clinical curiosity. They squeezed his biceps, examined his teeth, and ran their fingers through his hair. Jackson felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. He was an object, a plaything, with no control over his own body. Xylia watched the spectacle with a detached amusement. Yes, very fascinating, she said, clapping her hands together. But I think we're missing the most important question, aren't we? She turned to the auctioneer and spoke in its guttural language. The auctioneer nodded, and two hulking guards approached the dais. They grabbed Jackson by the ankles and spread his legs wide, exposing him completely to the crowd. Jackson cried out, a sound of pure, unadulterated horror. No. Stop it. What are you doing? Xylia knelt before him, her emerald eyes gleaming with a predatory light. Let's see what makes this little Earthling so special, shall we? Her gaze flicked downward, and a slow smile spread across her face. Well, she purred, her voice dripping with innuendo. It seems our little specimen is, surprisingly well equipped. I must say, gentlemen, this is quite the unexpected bonus. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. The murmurs intensified, taking on a new, excited edge. Jackson wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, so utterly and completely mortified. Xylia ran a finger along the length of him, her touch sending shivers down his spine despite his shame. Yes, she said, her voice a husky whisper. I think this one might be worth a closer look after all. The opulent chambers assigned to Jackson were a gilded cage, no doubt. Silk drapes the color of sunset cascaded from the high ceilings, pooling on floors inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Alien flora, bioluminescent and fragrant, filled the room with an otherworldly glow. Servants, silent and efficient, catered to his every whim. He had food, clothes, and a comfortable bed. But he was still a prisoner. Lyra, the princess who had purchased him, treated him with a mixture of amusement and possessiveness. She seemed genuinely fascinated by his humanity, constantly quizzing him about Earth customs, history, and technology. But her curiosity was always tinged with a sense of superiority, a feeling that he was an interesting, but ultimately inferior, specimen. Tell me more about this football you speak of, Lyra said one evening, reclining on a plush chaise lounge while Jackson sat stiffly on a nearby cushion. She was dressed in a flowing gown of shimmering emerald silk, her obsidian skin gleaming in the soft light. It's a game, Jackson explained, trying to keep his tone neutral. Two teams try to advance a ball down a field into the other team's end zone. There's a lot of running, tackling. Lyra wrinkled her nose. Sounds rather barbaric. Why would anyone engage in such a primitive activity? It's about strategy, teamwork, competition, Jackson countered, feeling a spark of annoyance. It's more complicated than it looks. Lyra laughed, a tinkling sound that grated on his nerves. Oh, I'm sure it is. But compared to the complexities of interstellar politics, the intricacies of quantum entanglement, or even the simple pleasure of composing a new symphony of sonic harmonies, it seems, rather insignificant, wouldn't you agree? Jackson clenched his fists, fighting the urge to retort. He was an engineer, not a diplomat or a philosopher. He knew his way around a plasma conduit, not the subtle nuances of alien social structures. But he refused to let her belittle him. "Maybe," he said, meeting her gaze. "But it's our insignificant thing. It's part of what makes us human. Just like your sonic harmonies are part of what makes you, you." Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly, as if surprised by his defiance. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she smiled, a slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "You're learning, Jackson," she said softly. "You're starting to understand the game." Life in the royal court was a constant game of intrigue and manipulation. Lyra was surrounded by sycophants and rivals, all vying for her attention and favor. Jackson quickly realized that he was just another pawn in their complex power struggles. One of Lyra's most prominent rivals was her cousin, Zorgan, a hulking, reptilian creature with a penchant for elaborate jewelry and cruel jokes. Zorgan made no secret of his disdain for Jackson, constantly belittling him and trying to undermine his position with Lyra. "Look at the little Earthling," Zorgan sneered one day, as Jackson accompanied Lyra on a stroll through the palace gardens. "So small, so weak, so utterly useless. What possible purpose could he serve, other than to amuse the princess with his pathetic antics?" Lyra raised an eyebrow, her eyes flashing with annoyance. "Jackson is my companion, Zorgan. He provides me with amusement and other services that you, with your limited imagination, could never comprehend." Zorgan chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that made Jackson's skin crawl. "Oh, I can imagine quite a few things, princess. But I doubt the Earthling can satisfy your desires as well as a true Lyran warrior." Lyra's face darkened. "Enough, Zorgan. I tire of your insults. Leave us." Zorgan bowed mockingly and slithered away, leaving Jackson feeling shaken and vulnerable. He knew that Zorgan was right, in a way. He was an outsider, a novelty, and his position in Lyra's court was precarious at best. As the days turned into weeks, Jackson began to notice cracks in the facade of Lyran society. He saw the casual cruelty with which they treated their servants, the rigid social hierarchy that stifled creativity and individuality, and the underlying sense of fear and resentment that simmered beneath the surface. He overheard hushed conversations between servants, whispers of rebellion and discontent. He saw the harsh punishments meted out to those who dared to question the status quo. He realized that Lyra's comfortable existence was built on the backs of the oppressed. One evening, while exploring a hidden corner of the palace library, Jackson stumbled upon a secret room. Inside, he found shelves lined with forbidden texts, holographic displays filled with coded messages, and a group of aliens huddled around a table, their faces grim and determined. They were rebels, dissidents who dared to dream of a different future for the Lyran Empire. They were led by a grizzled old warrior named Corvith, a veteran of countless battles and a staunch believer in freedom and equality. "Who are you?" Corvith demanded, his voice rough and wary. "How did you find this place?" Jackson hesitated, unsure whether to trust them. But he saw the fire in their eyes, the passion in their hearts, and he knew that he had found kindred spirits. "I'm Jackson," he said. "I'm a prisoner here. But I don't belong here. I want to help." Corvith studied him for a long moment, his gaze piercing and intense. Then, he nodded slowly. "We've heard of you, Earthling. The princess's pet. We weren't sure what to make of you." "I'm not a pet," Jackson said, his voice hardening. "I'm a human being. And I'm tired of being treated like a toy." Corvith smiled, a rare and genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. "Then welcome, Jackson Ford. Welcome to the resistance." The decision to join the rebellion was not an easy one. Jackson knew that he was risking his life, his comfortable existence, and even his relationship with Lyra. But he couldn't stand by and watch while innocent beings suffered under the tyrannical rule of the Lyran dynasty. He began meeting with the rebels in secret, learning about their plans, their strategies, and their hopes for the future. He discovered that they were not just fighting for their own freedom, but for the freedom of all the oppressed species in the galaxy. He learned about the brutal conquest of the planet Xylos, the enslavement of the Zidonian miners, and the systematic extermination of the Grokner people. He realized that the Lyran Empire was built on a foundation of blood and lies. He also learned that the rebels were severely outmatched and outgunned. They lacked the resources, the technology, and the manpower to challenge the Lyran dynasty directly. They needed a new weapon, a new strategy, something that could level the playing field. That's when Jackson realized that he could offer them something that no one else could, his knowledge of Earth technology. He had spent years studying engineering, physics, and computer science. He knew how to build things, how to fix things, how to make things work. He proposed a daring plan to the rebels. They would infiltrate the palace armory, steal the schematics for the Lyran's most advanced weapons, and use his knowledge to reverse engineer them, creating a new generation of weapons that could challenge the Lyran's dominance. The rebels were skeptical at first. They didn't trust Jackson completely. They feared that he was a spy, sent by Lyra to infiltrate their ranks. But Jackson convinced them that he was sincere, that he was willing to risk everything for their cause. He used his access to the palace to gather intelligence, to map out the security systems, and to identify the weaknesses in the Lyran's defenses. He worked tirelessly, day and night, driven by a burning desire to make a difference. But his secret activities did not go unnoticed. Lyra began to suspect that something was amiss. She noticed that Jackson was spending less time with her, that he was more distant and preoccupied. She sensed that he was hiding something from her. One evening, as they were preparing for bed, Lyra confronted him. "What's wrong, Jackson?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. "You've been acting strangely lately. Are you unhappy here?" Jackson hesitated, torn between his loyalty to the rebels and his growing affection for Lyra. He knew that if he told her the truth, he would be betraying her trust, and he would likely be imprisoned or even executed. But he couldn't lie to her any longer. "Lyra," he said, taking her hands in his. "There's something I need to tell you." He told her everything, about the rebels, about their plans, about his role in their rebellion. He told her about the atrocities committed by the Lyran dynasty, about the suffering of the oppressed species. Lyra listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he was finished, she pulled away from him, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock, anger, and betrayal. "How could you do this, Jackson?" she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "How could you betray me like this?" "I'm not betraying you, Lyra," Jackson said, pleading with her. "I'm trying to save you. Don't you see? This empire is corrupt, it's unsustainable. It will eventually collapse under its own weight. You need to get out, to start a new life, before it's too late." Lyra shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't," she said. "I'm a princess. I have a duty to my people, to my family. I can't just abandon them." "Then help us change things from within," Jackson urged. "Use your influence to reform the empire, to end the oppression, to create a better future for everyone." Lyra hesitated, her eyes searching his. For a moment, Jackson thought that he had reached her, that he had convinced her to join their cause. But then, her expression hardened. "I can't do that," she said. "I won't." She turned and walked away, leaving Jackson standing alone in the opulent chamber, his heart filled with despair. He knew that he had lost her, that their relationship was over. And he knew that he had made a powerful enemy. He had to escape. He had to warn the rebels that they had been compromised. He had to act fast, before it was too late. He packed a small bag with essential supplies, a weapon, a communicator, and a few pieces of alien currency. He slipped out of the palace, using his knowledge of the security systems to avoid detection. He made his way to the rebel hideout, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he was walking into a trap, that Lyra's guards were likely waiting for him. But he had no choice. He had to warn his friends. He reached the secret room in the library, his hand trembling as he opened the door. Inside, he found Corvith and the other rebels, their faces grim and determined. "We know," Corvith said, his voice low and grave. "The princess has betrayed us. The palace is surrounded. We have to get out of here." Jackson nodded, his mind racing. They were trapped, outmatched, and outgunned. But they were not defeated. They still had a chance. "We're going to need a plan," he said. "And I think I have one." The escape was chaotic. Alarms blared throughout the palace, casting the opulent hallways in a harsh, red light. Lyran guards, clad in gleaming armor, swarmed the corridors, their energy weapons crackling with deadly power. Jackson, armed with a stolen plasma pistol and fueled by adrenaline, fought alongside Corvith and the other rebels, their desperate stand echoing through the once serene halls. "We have to reach the outer perimeter," Corvith roared, deflecting a blast of energy with his vibrosword. "The escape pods are our only chance." Jackson, relying on his knowledge of the palace's layout, led the rebels through a series of hidden passages and service tunnels, avoiding the main force of the Lyran guard. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and the screams of the wounded. He felt a pang of guilt as he saw the bodies of fallen rebels, their dreams of freedom extinguished in the cold reality of war. They reached a large, open courtyard, where a fierce battle was raging. Lyran soldiers were entrenched behind energy shields, mowing down the rebels with relentless firepower. Jackson saw one of the rebels, a young Xylosian woman named Zelia, fall to the ground, clutching her chest. He rushed to her side, but it was too late. Her eyes were glazed over, her lifeblood staining the ground. "Damn it!" Jackson cursed, his heart filled with rage and despair. He raised his plasma pistol and unleashed a volley of fire at the Lyran soldiers, taking down several of them before they could react. Corvith, seeing the opportunity, led a charge across the courtyard, his vibrosword flashing in the red light. The rebels, fueled by desperation and rage, followed him, breaking through the Lyran defenses and scattering the enemy soldiers. They reached the escape pod bay, a large hangar filled with small, single-person escape pods. The Lyran guards had already secured the bay, but the rebels, with Jackson leading the charge, fought their way through, securing several of the pods. "There's only enough for a few of us," Corvith shouted, his voice hoarse. "The rest will have to find another way out." Jackson felt a surge of guilt. He knew that leaving the others behind was a death sentence. But they had no choice. They had to get off this planet, to warn the galaxy about the Lyran dynasty's cruelty. "I'm staying," Jackson said, his voice firm. "I'll help the others escape." Corvith looked at him with surprise, then with admiration. "You're a brave one, Earthling," he said. "But don't throw your life away. We need you." "I know," Jackson said. "But I can't leave them behind." He helped the remaining rebels secure the escape pods, ensuring that they had enough supplies and ammunition to survive. He gave them instructions on how to reach the neutral space station, where they could seek allies and expose the Lyran dynasty's crimes. As the last of the escape pods launched into space, Jackson turned to face the remaining rebels, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. "All right," he said, his voice ringing with determination. "Let's get the hell out of here." They retreated back into the palace, seeking refuge in the hidden passages and service tunnels. They moved stealthily, avoiding the main force of the Lyran guard, their hope dwindling with each passing hour. As they crept through the labyrinthine corridors, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. He sensed a presence, a watchful gaze that followed their every move. He knew that Lyra was watching them, that she was waiting for the right moment to strike. Finally, they reached a secluded chamber, a hidden sanctuary that Corvus had discovered years ago. It was a small, sparsely furnished room, but it offered them a temporary respite from the chaos outside. They collapsed onto the floor, exhausted and defeated. The weight of their failure pressed down on them, crushing their spirits. "What do we do now?" one of the rebels asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We're trapped. We're doomed." Jackson looked around at the faces of his companions, their eyes filled with fear and despair. He knew that he had to say something, to give them hope, to inspire them to fight on. "We're not doomed," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "We're still alive. And as long as we're alive, we have a chance. We have to keep fighting." He told them about his plan, about his idea to use the palace's communication systems to broadcast a message to the galaxy, exposing the Lyran dynasty's crimes and calling for help. The rebels were skeptical at first. They didn't think it was possible. They didn't think anyone would listen. But Jackson persisted, arguing that it was their only hope. Finally, they agreed to try. They knew that it was a long shot, but they had nothing to lose. Jackson, using his engineering skills, managed to bypass the palace's security systems and access the main communication hub. He worked tirelessly, day and night, crafting a message that would resonate with the oppressed species of the galaxy. He spoke of the Lyran dynasty's cruelty, of their brutal conquest of Xylos, of the enslavement of the Zidonian miners, and of the systematic extermination of the Grokner people. He called for unity, for resistance, for freedom. He finished the message, his hands trembling with exhaustion. He looked at his companions, their faces filled with hope and anticipation. "Are you ready?" he asked. They nodded in unison. Jackson pressed the button, and the message was sent, broadcasting across the galaxy. They waited, their hearts pounding in their chests, for a response. But the response never came. The hours turned into days, and still, there was silence. The rebels' hope dwindled, replaced by a crushing sense of despair. Jackson refused to give up. He knew that the message had reached someone, somewhere. He knew that there were others out there who would hear their call for help. He decided to take a risk, to leave the sanctuary and venture into the heart of the palace, to seek out Lyra and confront her directly. The rebels tried to dissuade him, arguing that it was too dangerous, that he would be killed. But Jackson was determined. He had to know why Lyra had betrayed them, why she had chosen to side with the oppressor instead of the oppressed. He slipped out of the sanctuary, his heart pounding in his chest. He moved stealthily, avoiding the Lyran guards, his plasma pistol held at the ready. He reached Lyra's private chambers, the opulent suite where he had once been her pampered pet. He hesitated for a moment, his hand trembling as he reached for the door. He took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping inside. Lyra was waiting for him, sitting on her throne, her face expressionless. "Jackson," she said, her voice cold and distant. "I knew you would come." "Why, Lyra?" Jackson asked, his voice filled with pain. "Why did you betray us?" Lyra stood up, her eyes flashing with anger. "I did what I had to do," she said. "I had a duty to my people, to my family. I couldn't let you destroy everything that I hold dear." "But we weren't trying to destroy anything," Jackson argued. "We were trying to build something better. A world where everyone is free, where everyone is equal." Lyra laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "That's a foolish dream, Jackson. A naive fantasy. There will always be those who rule, and those who are ruled. It's the natural order of things." "That's not true," Jackson said, his voice ringing with conviction. "We can change things. We can create a world where everyone has a chance to thrive, where everyone is treated with dignity and respect." Lyra shook her head, her eyes filled with pity. "You're a fool, Jackson," she said. "You'll never understand." She raised her hand, and two Lyran guards stepped forward, their energy weapons trained on Jackson. "Take him away," Lyra said, her voice devoid of emotion. He is to be executed for treason. Jackson stared at Lyra, his heart filled with sadness and disappointment. He had once believed that she was different, that she was capable of compassion and empathy. But he had been wrong. She was just another cog in the machine, another defender of the status quo. He allowed the guards to lead him away, his head held high, his spirit unbroken. He knew that his life was about to end. But he also knew that his message had been sent, that his words would live on, inspiring others to fight for freedom and justice. As he was led to the execution chamber, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had come to this alien world as a prisoner, a slave. But he was leaving as a rebel, a hero. He had made a difference. And that was all that mattered. The execution chamber was a cold, sterile room, filled with strange and menacing devices. Jackson was strapped to a metal table, his body trembling with fear and anticipation. Lyra entered the chamber, her face impassive. She approached Jackson, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and regret. "I'm sorry, Jackson," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I wish things could have been different." "So do I, Lyra," Jackson said, his voice firm. "But you made your choice. And now, I must face the consequences." Lyra nodded slowly. She turned to the executioner, a tall, gaunt figure clad in black robes. "Proceed," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. The executioner raised his hand, and a beam of energy shot out, striking Jackson in the chest. Jackson screamed, his body writhing in agony. He felt his life force draining away, his consciousness fading into darkness. And then, everything went black. But as Jackson's life flickered and died, a spark ignited in the hearts of the oppressed species of the galaxy. His message had been heard. His sacrifice had not been in vain. The rebellion had begun.